All right, so at this point, you know fully well that ATP is super important for our cells. It provides the energy. Remember the downhill reaction, the exergonic reaction that we couple to nearly everything that our cells has to do is ATP, okay, hydrolyzed into ADP and phosphate, right? So now this reaction is the reaction that is, we talked about in the previous lecture. This is the one that drives our various forms of cellular work. And what we're talking about now is how we're going to be restoring the ATP that gets consumed on a microsecond by microsecond basis. The restoration of ATP from ADP and phosphate, that's a big question mark that we're addressing with this lecture, right? A couple of things. I mean, sometimes we talk about ATP synthesis, and I'll put it in quotes because it's not really entirely clear what we mean by that. See, when you say something is synthesized, it almost means like you're putting it together from scratch, right? We'll take the carbons, or we'll take some raw materials and make ATP. No, that's not what's happening at all. You know, the ATP is practically already made. We have this ADP, which is kind of like spent fuel. We have a whole bunch of ADP that results every time we consume an ATP molecule from in order to carry out cellular work. And all that ADP is the starting point for the generation of new ATP. All we have to do is to add that extra phosphate, right? If we put that extra phosphate on, that makes ATP, which will then be used for cellular work, and then that will generate ADP again. And so this is basically a recycling process. We know that the part of the process is going to be involved with cellular work. We need the energy, and therefore we need to consume ATP and produce ADP and phosphate, right? At the same time, we also need to restore the ATP, and for that, we're going to be using these things called fueling reactions. Which is a really good term. I mean, when you fuel your car, you're basically recharging the gas tank so that you can go on again, right? So you consume the gas and you have to put more gas in. You consume the ATP and you have to put more ATP in the tank, right? And so by fueling reactions, we're talking about any of the reactions that will generate ATP. And by that, I mean, of course, using ADP and phosphate and putting that phosphate on to create the stored chemical energy that we have in the form of ATP. Okay? And there are really two ways we can do this. We can do this using light energy, or we could do this using other forms of chemical energy. Okay, so the fueling reactions might have one of two sources of energy: energy from light, or energy from chemicals. And your cells are obviously using chemicals. By chemicals, I mean food. Right? Food, as well as the oxygen that you breathe in, right? Food and oxygen, that's what you throw into the furnace in order to generate the energy that we'll be using to drive ATP. Light is basically exactly what it sounds like, where we have these impressive solar collectors. We call them plants. And plants have chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have green pigments like chlorophyll. And the energy from light is being converted from light energy into chemical energy through a mechanism that we're not able to do in our cells. We don't have the sophisticated mechanism to convert light energy into ATP. Plants do, right? And so we need to talk at least briefly about both of these things, right? And so this lecture is really just a pep talk for what's coming up in future lectures. And I'll just quickly say here, the plants, photosynthetic organisms, are generating ATP, actually, in a couple of different ways. Okay? One, there is a way that you can use the chlorophyll to generates the ATP more or less directly, right? So that's more, to actually say, for me to say anything more would basically be carrying me down a rabbit hole of detail. So let me just say that you can do it two ways. You can do it more directly. In other words, use the light energy and boom, make your ATP directly from light energy, right? Or another thing that plants do is that they go through the process of photosynthesis, make sugars, which is the other thing that plants do, and then they can metabolize the sugar using the same kind of mechanisms that our animal cells do, okay? And so plants are doing it this way. We call this photosynthesis. Okay, right? And so that's one mechanism. The other mechanism, which involves the energy from chemicals, food molecules being converted into ATP energy. Okay. It's food molecules are being converted into waste, right? So it's actually this: food, waste. Food represents high energy potential. Waste represents low energy potential. But in going from high to low, you know that there has to be a release of energy. And that's the energy used to generate ATP from ADP and phosphate. Okay. And so that's ultimately what we're talking about here. So if you have that concept in pretty clearly in your head, that's good. That's where I want you to be. Okay. And so one thing about animals that we're not able to do the photosynthesis thing. We're only able to take a molecule like sugar, could be an amino acid, it could be a fatty acid. We break down our food molecules and convert those food molecules into waste. And in the process, we generate some ATP energy. And that's basically what's going on. In the case of aerobic cells, we're doing that with oxygen, O2. There are plenty of cells that are anaerobic, meaning that they don't have any oxygen available, and they have to undergo their ATP generation without the help of oxygen. Yeasts and a lot of bacteria are anaerobic. And if you're doing it that way, then you're still going through the process of making food molecules, taking food molecules and converting them into waste. It's just the waste molecules are not as depleted of energy, and therefore we're going to get less energy because we don't have the oxygen to help us along. More on that later on, but basically we've got these two different forms of, we call it, we're going to put this, heterotrophy, because we're not getting our energy from a raw source. We have to eat we have to consume the energy that has been provided to us by another living organism. Okay, hetero means other, right? Different. And so we've got plants that are autotrophs, photosynthetic. They basically feed themselves using the carbon dioxide from the air. We can't do that. We can't use carbon dioxide from the air. The only thing that we can do is to eat another organism. Okay, that's what we mean by heterotrophy. And we've got two different forms of heterotrophic metabolic processes, one that requires oxygen and one that doesn't. Okay. So answer this question: why do we breathe? Well, at this point you're thinking, well, I've got a need to generate ATP. Right? The mechanism that I use to generate ATP is to convert food molecules into waste molecules. And this is happening with the help of oxygen because I'm an aerobic organism. And therefore, I need to provide my cells with a continual supply of oxygen. And that's effectively what breathing does. Okay? And so let's look over at our textbook chapters I know that you are following textbook very closely. There's 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3. Those are the ones that we have on the reading list for today. We breathe to provide the oxygen that's going to be supplying the all of our cells with the oxygen that's necessary in order to drive cellular respiration. Sure you can see this. So you see this? Cellular respiration requires oxygen. Oxygen is coming in through this process involving taking in oxygen in the form of air, gets carried from the lungs over to all the cells where you need the oxygen. And then the other thing that's happening here is that the end product of cellular respiration is CO2, and that is waste, right? And the waste molecule is carried away from the tissues, eventually making it over to the lungs. And so what you're breathing out is a mixture that contains a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. What you're breathing in is a mixture that contains a higher concentration of oxygen compared to the air that you're breathing out. And we're getting a net uptake of oxygen and a net removal of CO2 with every inhale and exhale. Good. Okay. The other thing to note here, it's actually on this diagram, but on 6.3, we're getting a nice summary equation for cellular respiration. This is going to be a good starting point for our next lecture. So let's make sure that we have a good feeling about this. Okay. And so this is something I'm hoping you'll be able to relate to very nicely. Glucose, C6H12O6, you understand what that is, right? It is a monosaccharide. Think of this as the food, right? That's the food molecule. Okay. We use oxygen. Oxygen is coming in from the air that we breathe, carried through the bloodstream over to every cell in your body. Every cell is consuming oxygen because it's combining the oxygen with glucose right through the process of cellular respiration. And in the cellular respiration process, we end up with waste molecules, which are carbon dioxide, as well as water. Okay? You know, the water that is waste here is just like any other water molecules. So this water simply becomes part of your overall water balance. The CO2, however, has to be removed. Right? And in the process, we're also generating ATP. For our cells, we get about roughly 36 molecules of ATP, which are actually 36 molecules of ADP and 36 phosphate groups, inorganic phosphate groups, getting combined to make 36 molecules of ATP. And then we're also generating heat. Remember that? Said that heat is accounts for that second law of thermodynamics, saying that we have to increase the overall disorderliness of the system. There's always going to be heat released. Anytime we have a conversion of chemical energy, okay, call this chemical energy form 1. At the end, we have ATP, which is also chemical energy. Call this chemical energy form 2, right? Converting from one form to another. We know that the total amount of energy has got to be the same, but the overall disorderliness of the system has to be increasing, and we're going to be getting that with the production of heat. Okay, so heat is there as a necessary side product, a byproduct of this conversion of energy from food into waste, or actually energy from food into ATP. All right, got that? This equation, I could write it again for you on the main slide. I'm going to do exactly that so you can make sure you get it in your notes. bright red ink. C6H12O6, that's glucose, right? Plus 6 molecules of O2, oxygen. That's going to give rise to 6 molecules of CO2, that's carbon dioxide that you're breathing out, plus 6 molecules of water, which is a waste molecule, but we don't really care about water as waste molecules because we're made up of water anyways. They just become part of us, right? This is going to be exergonic, energy released. And that's going to drive ATP production, right? And so this is our process of cellular respiration. And I apologize for not having letters that are always easy to read. Yeah, partly poor penmanship, but also partly the goofiness of the lag in my tablet pen. Okay. So anyways, this equation here is going to be the starting point. Yeah, this is something you should memorize, right? This is going to be the starting point for our contrast in the next video where we'll be talking about photosynthesis. All right, see you then.